Hi, this is Andy. If you are currently in a management role, do you remember what it was like when you first took on that new position? I mean, do you remember what your struggles were? For example, I went from being a software developer to a frontline manager, and one of my struggles was trying to figure out how hands on I should stay. And this is a classic challenge for new managers, and just one of a predictable set of challenges that we can struggle with. Well, Janet Polach joins us today to talk about her book, Seven Mistakes New Managers Make: How to Avoid Them and Thrive. Though it's a book for new managers, my take is that we could all benefit from being reminded about the traps we can easily fall into as we seek to become more effective leaders. In today's discussion, Janet will introduce us to some of those mistakes, such as doing instead of leading. She'll talk about why a strategic vision for your team is so easy to overlook. Assume that people already know it, as well as some lessons about how to provide clarity around that vision. She'll give some practical advice on building trust with your team, along with ideas on developing your team. And if you've ever struggled with how to give feedback effectively, Janet has some words of wisdom for you. It's a conversation I'm looking forward to sharing with you. Hey, quick note, I want to invite you to join our Lead 52 family. It's a global group of leaders who are committed to transforming our ability to lead and deliver. It's 52 weeks of leadership learning delivered right to your inbox, taking less than 5 minutes a week. It's all for free. Learn more and sign up at getlead52.com. Thanks. Well, let's jump into today's discussion with Janet about her book, Seven Mistakes New Managers Make. Janet, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Thank you so much, Andy. It's a delight to be here. And it's always a delight to talk about frontline leaders and how they can be more effective. There's an amazing finding from the Corporate Executive Board. 60% of new managers fail within the first 24 years. First 24 months of being in their new role. And the average leader, at least in the United States, and I do think this is generally around the world, is they're promoted to manager role the first somewhere late 20s, maybe early 30s. The average doesn't get any leadership development until their mid 40s.
Wow, who doesn't sound...
So they're operating by the seat of their pants for 12, 15 years.
Yeah, I can relate to that. And, like a lot of people listen to us are project managers. Most of them didn't aspire to be a project manager. They got promoted into that role and probably weren't trained into it. So I think we can all relate to that 60% number. We've seen it. But before we get into the book, I'd love for our listeners to learn more about you, Janet. Like, can you think of any influences from your family culture growing up that influenced how you think about leadership?
My influence about leadership came with my first career choice. I grew up in a small town in Red Wing, Minnesota, home of Red Wing shoes, if you've ever heard of them.
Sure, yeah.
And I was trained to be an elementary school teacher. I happened to graduate at a time when there was a recession, and so lots of schools were closing down and consolidating. And so I said, well, what am I going to do with this degree that I worked really hard on? So I joined the Marine Corps. I looked at all four services, and quite honestly, the Marine recruiters were just so much better at pushing my belonging buttons than anybody else. My dad had been a veteran. I didn't have lots of veterans in my family, but I thought it's only 3 or 4 years. Why not give it a try? And I did, and it changed my life.
Yeah.
The United States Marine Corps, like so many of the services, spend a lot of time around leadership. I was commissioned as a second lieutenant. We learned the basics of what good leadership looks like. We had lots of great role models. And fundamentally in the Marine Corps, it's a life or death issue around good leadership, because anytime your leader can be cut down in combat. And so we prepare people to take up the reins if that should happen. And that formed my underpinnings about what is leadership and what does effective leadership really look like.
Oh, it seems like the Marines have just a remarkable record of giving young officers a lot of responsibility. And, we'll get into your book, I promise, but I'm just curious about this. Can you think of something that the Marines do to develop leaders that may not be obvious, or something that we often don't do in the corporate world?
Well, they spend a lot of time on leadership development that we don't do in the corporate world. So average vice president has maybe had, let's say, 5 or 6 weeks collectively of leadership development over their career. They've had a couple week-long programs. Maybe then they've been lucky enough to go to Kellogg or Harvard and gotten that 6 or 8 month experience. But most of them go through their careers with an executive coach, a few workshops here and there. In the Marine Corps, you start as a second lieutenant and have 5 months of leadership training. And then as a captain, you go to a 9 months amphibious warfare school. And then as a colonel, you go to a 2-year strategic leadership academy. And if you're enlisted, it's the same kind of thing. There's an NCO academy and a staff non-commissioned officer academy. And so the Marine Corps is really committed to learning and developing. Now, granted, not all of that is spent about how do I lead. It's spent on tactics and weapons and so forth, but you can't execute a strategy unless you know how to lead other people. And so I think I make reference to the Marine Corps often when I work with my corporate accounts. And I think there's a lot that we can learn, even though we're not a United States Marine Corps.
Yeah, I agree. I think we can learn all across all kinds of different, examples. In fact, I feel like that's one of the themes of your book is you can learn to lead by watching other leaders. I think you mentioned that at least 2 or 3 times in the book. Watch how other people deal with that, and you can definitely learn that way. I like to say that I was promoted into management for all the wrong reasons, Janet. I was a reasonably good software developer, and we had a company that bought us out. And when that happened, some of the managers got let go, and they're like, "Well, why not put him into management role?" Right? And I think this pattern of promoting people, without giving them the training, is just, we see it over and over and over. So one of the things I really struggle with myself, Janet, and I mentioned in the opening, is this doing versus leading. And I'm curious, even to this day, with all the training you've had, all the experience, I mean, you turned those, like, I think you said 4 years of the Marines into 20 years, and that was about 20 years ago, right? So I mean, so I mean, you've got a lot of experience. But do you personally have any struggles with that even today, of this leading versus doing? And what's some advice you might share with the listeners who know that their leading doing quotient is off?
Yeah. So I think it depends how big your team is. But I think we need to think about, because we promote people because they're so good at what they do. And then suddenly they're a manager. If we were to draw a Venn diagram of, senior software engineer experience and capabilities versus management capabilities, there's probably a 10% overlap in terms of skills and capabilities. So we don't necessarily prepare our brand new managers to lead effectively. I think, though, the second thing is that we, you check yourself versus long-term versus short-term impact or result. So short-term, it's much easier to do it myself. I know how to do it. It will be done the way I want. My boss has an expectation about how it's going to be done. But your team gets stuck in first gear because nobody learns anything new. We don't get a sense of broadening our team capabilities. We might not be tapping into the interests and aspirations of our team members. And so in 6 months from now, your team is stuck doing exactly what they used to do, and you as the manager are doing all the work.
Yeah. You talk about reframing in that chapter, if I remember right. And would you explain what you mean by that?
The reframing is about having the joy, the passion, the interest of working through others rather than working yourself. And in the United States, we have a very common experience of being in middle school and grade school sports and high school sports. Most sports coaches, let's pick soccer, for example, football, and, most of them are parents who used to do the sport themselves. And it's such a great example because, at 35, you don't have maybe the same agility as you did as a 10-year-old, but you can still teach fundamentals. You can still encourage growth. You can still encourage teamwork. And I think that's what we need to think about as a manager. Not only would it be illegal for the game if the 35-year-old mom stepped into the 10-year-old's game, but the 10-year-olds aren't learning and they're not winning for themselves. And so maybe that's a helpful analogy to think about. Well, if I was coaching my kids' soccer team, would I play the game for them? Absolutely not. I'd encourage them. I teach them skills. I develop their basic tactics with them. And then I'd step on the side and I watch and I'd encourage them.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, that's good. I think you also talk in that section there about clarify why you even want to be a manager. Cause I think sometimes the opportunities there, we just do it, or people aspire for a paycheck, but they don't aspire to lead. Right. And so you actually
Absolutely.
encourage people like, why do you want this?
Yes. Why do you want to lead? Do you really want to work through other people? Or do you want to, do you fundamentally like to watch people grow and develop?
Mhm.
Is it fun to watch learning happening? Is it fun to see people have success and do it in a different and albeit better way than what you would have done? And I think that's the fundamental of management or leadership.
Mhm. Yeah. Let's say a listener to us, Janet, they're taking on a new team, and you talk in your book about the need to set a strategic vision, which I agree with you. In the book, you mentioned something along the lines of it's easy to take that for granted. So, can you think of an example of how you've done this, whether it's in your Marine days or since, and any other lessons you've learned about clarity on team vision?
Yeah. So we promote people into manager. We often promote them within their own team. And so they just assume that they know what the team is responsible for and how they're going to get there. And what I argue is one of the first things a manager should do, whether they're long-term or brand new to the role, is sit down with the team and say, what are we really responsible for? And how does that tie into the mission of the organization or the function? And really articulate that. In the book, I talk about a team purpose,
Mhm.
and I think it's just a great exercise. One of the last roles my husband had was before he retired is he was the facilities director of a very large cathedral church in downtown Minneapolis. And I said, so your team, Joe, it was a small team. What's your purpose? And he said, well, to clean the place. And I said, well, why?
Yeah.
And so he actually had an experience with his custodial staff about, and they discovered that when everything is in good repair, when there aren't distracting coffee stains on the carpet, that worshipers can come to the building and focus on why they're there, which is a sacred journey, and not, oh my gosh, that glass is still broken in that beautiful window. Is it ever going to get fixed?
Right.
And so taking time to say, what is our purpose? And then what is each person on our team responsible for? And that's a great time to say, oh, I do the monthly report and I just don't like doing it. I'm not very good at it. It takes me hours and hours to put together. Is there anyone that would like to learn how to do that? And so it's a great opportunity to expand the team's capabilities and move things around in terms of what people really have passion for doing.
Yeah. You mentioned, I seem to recall that was the chapter where you mentioned the 5 paragraph order from the Marines
Mhm,
and the idea of
mhm.
commander's intent. Have you found ways to apply that outside of the Marines?
I absolutely have. So probably I was a first lieutenant or maybe a captain when the 5 paragraph order evolved in the United States Marine Corps. The paragraph order is given to any unit that has a mission,
Mhm.
and it specifies what resources you're going to have, what are you're expected to accomplish. And what was added is this expression of in order to. So if I can't get on top of that hill, but the longer term is to secure the port,
Mhm.
how am I authorized, and not in the moment of the battle, but am I authorized to go around the hill but still help support secure the port? And so I think in business, helping each team, if you're a customer service team, in order to do what? Are we retaining customers? Are we making sure that we have a 10 on our NPS score? Are we making sure that product development knows where all the flaws are in the products? Because we're right at the, in all of those, you would manage your team differently.
Yeah.
But until you articulate your actual team's purpose, we're all working on different things.
Yeah, and we just make assumptions. And the this idea of commander's intent, I think, is interesting because instead of just follow something that's in a spec document or in a project. Here's the why. Once again, like this is what we're trying to achieve, and just making sure that is never forgotten. Okay?
Yeah, yeah. And I think it applies, all of those who are on the call that focus on software development. We try to really get clear in these spec documents, requirements documents, and yet in the middle of it, people are designing and testing and finding a better way to do it. 3 less steps, which I think is a good example of commander's intent. We want to create an application that does X, and here's our requirements, but as we get in, which is, I guess, what Agile is all about, do we have that flexibility to make recommendations that these 2 steps could be consolidated into one?
Yeah, yeah, there you go. It's good. Part of helping a team function well is what you refer to as building trust and sustainability. So
Mhm.
what are some things you do to develop trust with new teams, Janet, or with team members?
Yeah. I think the best way you can do it is have regular one-on-ones with your staff. And this is what I seem to be talking about more and more. I think there's a great tie to retention when you do one-on-ones. And when I talk to people about one-on-ones, they say, oh, I check in with my team members every single day. I know exactly what they're working on. Well, you may know what they're working on, but do you know what they're learning? Do you know what their challenges are? Do you know what their aspirations are? So good one-on-ones start with, how are you doing? And I think that's the biggest thing we learned from these last 2 COVID years, is to really pause about, how are you holding up? And just listen, not to solution, but to just recognize that person that, wow, that's really tough having your 2 kids at home and 2 dogs and 2 spouses that are trying to work full time and you don't have enough bandwidth. I can't solve for that, but I can appreciate that that's a very difficult situation. The second step then is to talk about accomplishments. And of course, so much as leaders, we want to dive right into, where are you struggling? But to start with accomplishments says, what did you learn? What do you feel good about? And you can get a chance to jot that down, so when performance review time comes, you've actually captured that. Then we talk about obstacles. What's getting in the way? And this is a chance, I think, for managers to step back and listen to the employee and ask them, how are you going to solve this? What have you thought about? What support do you need? Again, not to step in ourselves and solution. Oh, I was in the same position 3 years ago, and here's what I did. Well, there's no learning in that. And then finally, you close out by saying, so who's responsible for what, and when are we going to meet next?
That's good. Just making that just a regular part of our cadence. So this is how we interact. And I seem to recall you had something there of not only getting feedback with each other, but or with, let's say manager to their team member, but also feedback to each other. Was there something there about?
Yeah.
Yeah. Would you explain that?
So there was a great study all the way back in, I think, 1972. Alan Church interviewed a number of leaders and their subordinates, and he discovered that leaders who are more self-aware, so their own feedback lines up very closely to their subordinates' feedback, are much more effective leaders than those who are disaligned. It seems kind of natural, and it seems kind of, yeah, that makes sense. So how do they do that? They do that by asking for feedback all the time. And they don't, Andy, just say, so how did that meeting go? Well, we got through the agenda, people weren't angry at the end of it, but they tried to provide very specific requests for feedback. I'm working on my influence skills. Notice in this next meeting how I'm doing. I'm trying to suspend saying and when I talk to a group of senior leaders. Can you listen for that? That other person can give really good feedback if they know what to look for. Yeah. And we get away from, oh, you're a rock star, you knocked it out of the park, these great big platitudes that are just they're not actionable and they're not real.
Yeah, that's good. One of the mistakes you call out in the book is not developing our team. And, I'd be interested in your take, your experience, like, why don't we do that more? And what are some ways you develop team members, even when workloads are high and training budgets are low?
Yes. So I think what we know from research is that the best kind of learning happens right in the flow of work. You send somebody off to a workshop and they're like, oh, that was really interesting, but how do I apply it when I get back? nearly every team meets at least once a week formally. They meet for an hour and a half. They talk about what's going on. I think that you allocate 10 or 15 minutes to every meeting for learning. You
Mm,
know, we use a lot of Excel. Can somebody teach us how to create a macro, for example? Or is there a shortcut that you have learned? 10 minutes, everybody pulls out their computer, we all do a macro, everybody tests it. Now we all have a new skill. So you insert it into the flow of work, and you don't add it onto your agenda, but you insert it into the time that you're already spending together as a team.
yeah, that's good. I mean, it could be something like, well, here's an article I read. Let's take 10 minutes and talk about it, right? It could be
Yep,
you mentioned TED Talks in there. It could be, hey, let's just watch a TED Talk or watch this ahead of
absolutely.
time in the meeting. Let's talk about it in the meeting, right? It doesn't have to be some big formal thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, you mentioned the 70-20-10 a couple times, and I think that
Mhm.
I took your comment here, just right here, of the 70% of the way we really learn things anyway is in the
Mhm.
flow of the work of doing it
Yep.
ourselves, right?
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
20% is from mentoring from others. And then, of course, 10% is going off to a course.
Mhm.
And as managers, we think that that is so easy to do. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You can go off to that testing course. What happens, though, is so often employees pull themselves out. They
Mhm.
say they're too busy to be gone for a whole day or 2 days or plus travel and all of that. And so they don't go themselves either.
Mhm.
So creating time within the work week, I think, is a great way to make sure learning is happening.
That's so good, Janet. One of the most prominent themes, if I understand right, from the research for your doctoral dissertation is that recent college graduates felt like they had lack of feedback. And that's probably true for a lot of us. So,
Yeah.
in addition to not providing feedback, what are some mistakes we can make when we're trying to get feedback?
Well, I think the first thing is to prepare.
Mhm.
If you give especially critical feedback in the moment, your emotions are going to fall into it. I think most of us, when we make a mistake, we know about it and we already feel badly. So to be able to have our manager tell me on top of me just making a mistake, you really screwed up this presentation. Don't ever do that again. I don't think is productive. So pausing. I think the second thing is describing what happened and describing the impact that that behavior had on you and others. So let's talk about being late. So you were supposed to get your analysis. I was supposed to get my analysis to you by the end of the day today. And, it's Friday afternoon. And so I'm going to do work on it over the weekend. And now I get it to you by about 10 o'clock on Monday. Well, maybe you, Andy, were planning to spend the whole weekend working on the next steps on whatever this report is that we're doing. And so I impacted you in a very negative way.
Mhm.
And so describing the impact that that behavior, whether it's lateness or not double checking your work or, taking credit for someone else's work has an impact. And I think those two things are really important. And then having a discussion about what am I going to do next time? Good feedback doesn't plow old ground. It really focuses on, okay, so how do we double check your work next time? How do you make sure you get it done on time? How do you make sure that the test plan is really ready before the testers are in place?
Mhm. Right. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. It's good.
Yeah.
Something that I feel like I got out of your book that I hadn't seen in others when it comes to feedback was, yeah, and I seem to recall you said it a couple of times. This is about creating a discussion, not an argument. Which I think it's most of us wouldn't say we're trying to get an argument, but it turns into that. But feedback is about a discussion. Yeah.
It is about a discussion. Yeah. How can I improve and grow? Franklin Covey has a couple of great leadership programs, and they talk in their feedback about redirecting feedback, which is corrective feedback, and then reinforcing feedback, which is recognition.
Mhm.
You can use the same model to give recognition feedback that you can use for constructive feedback. Talk about what the person did, talk about the impact that it had, which then moves into that discussion rather than, great job, Andy, nice presentation, thank you.
Mhm.
So Andy's left with, so what was good about it?
Right. Yeah.
How do I learn and grow?
Mhm. You had something from your education training, if I remember right, called Anecdotal Records. I got that from the book. And so would you explain what that works? Because I think that idea can apply not just for teachers, but for us as well.
Yeah. So I learned that in my undergrad, like you said, and teachers were encouraged to just take notes. You can take them on your phone and your text. Back in the day, we actually wrote them down and I put them in a jar that was on my desk. So then it was when it was time to write, and with 4-year-olds, you don't talk about performance reviews, but when
Yeah.
you do developmental check-ins, you had this great evidence of, oh, back in May, this person did X. And what I've done, I've kept that and I keep it in a Word document. You can keep it in Teams. You can keep it wherever is handy for you. Today, Sharon made a presentation to the executives and they asked engaging questions and it moved us to yes so much faster. That's all you need to do. So then when 6 months from now, I haven't just thought about what Sharon did last week. I've looked back and looked at those anecdotal records that really captured all the goodness of what Sharon has contributed over the last year.
Yeah, that's just a neat idea. And I suppose there's something about giving it immediately so we don't have to pile up a bunch of records on it. But still, sometimes you get to the end of the year, you're doing a performance review and you're like, what can I say about their last year? Where if we're taking notes along the way, it can really inform it.
Yeah.
People need to get a copy of the book to get all the insights you share. And there are a lot packed into a book that's like 120 pages or less. But let me just end with this, Janet. We have a lot of parents who listen to the podcast, and you mentioned in the introduction, I believe it was, that you have 2 children. Can you think of anything that you and your husband did to develop leadership skills in your children as they were growing up?
Yeah. Someone asked me the other day, what was I proudest of in my career? And without hesitation, I said, my grown children. They're really nice people who contribute to society. And so I think what I gave them from a leadership perspective is kindness and caring for others, because good leaders care about the people who they work with and they take action on that. They say thank you. They remind people about a good job that they're doing. And my 2 kids do that on a regular basis. They send notes to their friends. They send notes to us. And because of that, I think they're really good employees.
That's beautiful. Yeah. Well, for those listening, if you are a new manager or find yourself wrestling with some of these issues we've talked about today, consider getting a copy of Janet's book, The 7 Mistakes New Managers Make. I put links to the book and the book's website in the show notes for this cast. So, Janet, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Thanks so much, Andy.